Africa makes up only 2.4% of global exports in terms of share. Trade between African countries, that is intra-African trade, is only at 15% compared to other continents such as Europe that has over 70 or close to 70% of its trade within countries of itself, as well as Asia has over 50% of its trade internally. So we would need to be able to look at the history of commerce and trade and African integration to be able to understand why Africa finds itself in the margins of global trade and global commerce. So let's get started. Welcome to the first segment or episode on this series on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. That's quite a mouthful, the AFCFTA. And before I wanted to go into the inner workings of how the agreement works, I thought it would be important to look at the long history of trade and commerce that exists on the African continent. And here are some few points why. I think one, it's crucial to be able to understand the history of African trade, to be able to understand, as I said at the start of the video, why does Africa find itself in the margins of global trade and commerce till today? And this definitely has historical reason as to why this is the case. I think the second reason I wanted to talk about the history of trade and commerce, and as you will see during the course of this episode, trade and commerce is just not all about the exchange of goods and services and monetary transactions, but it's also about the exchange of ideas, the exchange of cultures. And definitely we have a history of seeing how trade influences culture, religion, and the spread of different ideas. And hopefully we'll be able to learn from these lessons and also be able to apply them as we're trying to understand the implications of the African free trade area kind of agreement. So this is how we'll start this week. This week we'll be looking at pre-colonial African trade and commerce. And next week we'll look at the legacy of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and also how the African Union has tried to integrate the continent and the challenges that have come as a result of that. So really excited to get started. So let's move on swiftly to the next segment. So trade has existed on the African continent for centuries, if not millennia, if even not longer. And we can think of ancient empires and states such as ancient Egypt. We can think of the ancient city of Carthage, which is in modern-day Tunisia, that had its own currency. We can think of the ancient city of Aksum that existed around 900, 800 AD, that had also its own medium of exchange and traded with the wider world. But I will start with an example in the not so distant past, at least relatively. I'll start with a man who goes by the name Mansa Musa, who lived in present-day Mali and was the king of an empire called Mali, which essentially was one of the richest and most vast empires in the 14th century on the continent. Mansa Musa is touted to be the richest man in history, and his riches was so vast that in some of the records, in some of the historical records, people talk about his pilgrimage to Mecca. And while he was traveling to Mecca with a caravan of camels, he had so much gold that when he visited Cairo, the economy took about 12 years to recover from his visit, because gold was saturated in the economy because he brought so much gold into the city. And it took about 12 years to recover. So just that shows like the vastness of the wealth. So Mansa Musa oversaw not only the commercial growth of this empire, but also the empire became a beacon of knowledge and expertise and actually boasts to have one of the oldest universities, one of the oldest active universities in the world, the University of Sankore, that was established around the 12th century. And most of you may have heard of the ancient city of Timbuktu that became a trading center for the region. And at this time, Timbuktu was one of many cities on the African continent that were centers of trade and center of inter-African trade and centers of commerce. Africa this time was very interconnected with different types of trade links. And this was one of many trading centers that emerged between the 13th and the 17th century on the African continent. In West Africa, you have kingdoms that emerged and empires that emerged around the same time, such as the Empire of Songhai, the Empire of Mali itself, the Kanem-Bornu Empire as well, that is in current day northern Nigeria and parts of Chad. All of these empires depended on the very active mercantile culture that, based on the trade of goods such as gold, spices, ivory to the wider world. West Africa really depended on the trans-Saharan trade route that was characterized by caravans of camels that would transport goods and people as well across the Sahel. And these trade links were so elaborate that they would stretch from cities such as Timbuktu or Gao that would go all the way to Morocco, to Fez, to cities such as Cairo, and to the wider world, into the Mediterranean and to the Arab world. So essentially, this was one of the examples where you saw the elaborate trade links that completely changed the outlook of African empires. If you look at the East, you have a network of coastal cities in East Africa, such as Mogadishu, Malindi, Lamu, and Kilwa, that also created a lot of riches from the commerce, especially through the Indian Ocean. And the main trading kind of connector or vessel was the dhow, or the boat, which essentially transported goods and people across the Indian Ocean to places like India, to places like China. And this trade really helped bring up the empires and states around the East African coast. We could also make reference to some of the great empires in the south, more inland. And one such empire was the Kingdom of Zimbabwe that probably reached its apex around the 13th and 14th centuries. And one of the most striking things about this empire, and we probably still see it today, are the ruins of the Great Zimbabwe Wall. And essentially this edifice was a show of the prowess and the wealth of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. And a big reason to this wealth, of course, was agricultural prowess, but also the commercial links with traders, the Swahili traders in the coast of East Africa, particularly in Kilwa. And I think that's a very interesting element to see how connected Africa was during that time, and how intra-African trade was being conducted, and how elaborate some of these links were. And probably we'll have to see how far the AFCFTA will go in trying to rebuild some of these links. But I think it's just wonderful to see some, when you look at the history, it's wonderful to see how interconnected Africa really was, and how connected as well in terms of global trade Africa was, and a player as well in terms of being able to stake their claim around global commerce and trade. I think another element that was pretty interesting about this period is, the period between the 13th and 17th century on the African continent with regard to empires and states before colonialism. I think the mechanisms of diplomacy that we see today, such as, the inviolability of conventions and treaties, the sending of envoys to different countries, the diplomatic immunity of diplomats. We saw the same thing around this time, and people were able to, the empires and states during this time, that existed during this time, were able to build relationships with each other and with the outside world. There was a lot of intra-African diplomacy and exchange, and there was also exchange with the wider world. And I think one example that really stood out for me was the example in around 1400s. In the around 1400s, there was a delegation from the East African coastal city of Malindi, which is in the coast of modern day Kenya. A delegation was sent from Malindi to China, and we had a giraffe that was sent to the emperor. At the time, it was the Ming Dynasty that was reigning over China. And we have pictures from that time, or depictions of a giraffe being presented to the emperor by a delegation of envoys from Malindi. So it's very interesting to see how the same mechanisms that we use today for brokering diplomacy, brokering trade deals, peace deals, were existent during that time. And that also goes to show how connected Africa was to the world, and how connected Africa was towards, itself. And this probably goes against some of the common knowledge in quotes that has infiltrated, history books around what Africa looked like before the colonialists came on the continent. So when we talk about the legacy of these trade links, we can still see the legacy of these links today. So, for example, Swahili is now a language that is spoken by close to 200 million people around East Africa in close to 10 countries. That's Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, parts of Mozambique, parts of Malawi, Comoros, amongst others, Burundi as well. So Swahili, that was used as a lingua franca, as a trading language during the 13th to the 17th century, when Swahili traders were at their apex of trade and commerce, has become a lingua franca, and that's definitely one legacy of the trade links. Another legacy you could also see just on a religious level, where Islam is still practiced by millions of people in West Africa, the Empire of Mali, where Mansa Musa presided over. Islam was perhaps, really the religion of the state, so to say. And the same thing with East Africa, the East African coast. You find, large populations of Muslim people, and that's definitely also a legacy of these trade links. So I hope from this episode you've been able to see how pivotal trade and commerce is in being able to shape not only the economic destiny of an empire or a state or a nation, but it can also shape the political and cultural as well as the social fabric of a country, nation, a continent. And I think that is why I'm so excited about the opportunity to look at how the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement could also bring some of these legacies as well back to life. So I think it'll be very interesting to be able to see that. So during the course of this episode, we have looked at one, what did pre-colonial trade look like? We looked at some of the mechanisms of diplomacy that were used around that time, and we've reflected on the legacy of the trade links that existed during this time and how it speaks to how our trading system works today. Next week, we'll be looking at the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and also look at how the African Union has been trying to integrate the continent. The AFCFTA is definitely not the first attempt to try to integrate African markets and African trade. So we'll look at how that has developed over the years. But otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in to this first episode of our series on the AFCFTA, such a mouthful. I keep on struggling with that. The AFCFTA, and really looking forward to having you tune into the next few episodes. Again, I'd like to remind you to like, comment, subscribe if you'd like to learn more about this subject. Thank you so much for tuning in.